Welcome to WW2 Heroic Tales, where true stories of courage, sacrifice, and extraordinary heroism come alive from the darkest days of World War II. Join us as we uncover the untold moments that shaped history. The year is 1950. The world, still healing from the scars of a global war, is thrust into a new and brutal conflict on the Korean peninsula. Often called the Forgotten War, this clash of ideologies saw United Nations forces, led by the United States, confront the expansion of communism from the north. By autumn, UN troops had pushed deep into North Korea, nearing the Yalu River and the border with China. A sense of imminent victory filled the air. But this optimism was a fragile illusion, about to be shattered by a force of unimaginable scale. In late October, Chairman Mao Zedong, fearing an American presence on his border, secretly sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the People's Volunteer Army, or PVA, across the river. They were a ghost army, moving only at night through the rugged, frozen terrain, remaining invisible to American air reconnaissance. Their equipment was Spartan, often lacking heavy artillery and armor, but they possessed overwhelming numbers, iron discipline, and a mastery of guerrilla tactics. The stage was set for one of the most shocking and violent reversals in modern military history. U.S. commanders, including General Douglas MacArthur, gravely underestimated the threat, dismissing initial reports of Chinese troops as minor incursions. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic. As the first snows of a bitter Korean winter began to fall, this hidden army prepared to strike, targeting the overstretched and isolated UN units. The temperature plummeted, freezing weapons and claiming limbs with frostbite, turning the landscape into an unforgiving third enemy. In this frozen crucible, amidst the politics of superpowers and the grand strategies of generals, the fate of individual soldiers would be decided by courage, endurance, and the will to survive against impossible odds. Among the men of the U.S. Army's 1st Cavalry Division was a humble farm boy from Pilsen, Kansas, Chaplain Emil Kapaun. He was not a typical soldier. His weapon was his faith, his armor was his cassock, and his mission was to serve the spiritual and moral needs of his men. Ordained a Roman Catholic priest in 1940, Kapaun had served in the final years of World War II in the China-Burma-India theater. When that conflict ended, he returned to parish life, but felt a persistent calling to serve soldiers in the field. He re-enlisted in 1948, telling his bishop that he knew he could help the men more in the military. By 1950, he was attached to the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment. Kapaun was beloved by his troops, regardless of their own faith. He was known for his quiet demeanor, his tireless work ethic, and his complete lack of pretension. He earned their respect not with sermons from a pulpit, but with actions in the mud and grit of combat. He was often seen at the front lines, sharing a cigarette, a word of encouragement, or simply his presence. He famously rigged up a makeshift PA system on his Jeep to play music for the troops, and used the hood of that same Jeep as an altar for Mass, often under the threat of artillery fire. His Jeep, which he nicknamed the Grasshopper, was a familiar sight, bouncing over rutted roads to deliver mail, supplies, and solace. He seemed to be everywhere at once, a constant source of calm in the chaos of war. He saw his role as more than just performing religious rites. He was a brother to the men, a confidant, and a reminder of the humanity they fought to preserve. This unwavering dedication would soon be tested in a way few could imagine, as the hidden Chinese army prepared to unleash its devastating offensive. On the night of November 1st, 1950, near the town of Unsan, the world collapsed for the 8th Cavalry Regiment. The Chinese struck without warning, a human wave of soldiers emerging from the darkness. The night air, already frigid, was split by the chilling sound of bugles, whistles, and shouts, psychological tactics designed to sow terror and confusion. Mortar rounds and grenades rained down on the American positions as PVA infantry swarmed through the lines, their sheer numbers overwhelming the defenders. The 8th Cavalry, strung out along a road in a narrow valley, was caught in a perfectly executed trap. Communications were severed almost immediately. Units were cut off, surrounded, and systematically annihilated. The fighting was desperate and at close quarters, a chaotic maelstrom of muzzle flashes, explosions, and screams. The Americans fought back with everything they had: Moan Garans, Bars, machine guns, and artillery. But they were facing an enemy that seemed to materialize from the very ground itself. Chaplain Kapaun was in the thick of it. As his battalion's command post came under intense fire, he moved through the maelstrom, heedless of the danger. He was seen dragging wounded men from burning vehicles, administering first aid under a hail of bullets, and offering last rites to the dying. His calm presence was a rock in a sea of panic. Survivors would later recall his voice cutting through the din, urging men to keep fighting, to not give up hope. He was a shepherd tending his flock in the middle of a slaughter. By dawn, the situation was hopeless. The regiment was shattered, its positions overrun. The survivors were scattered, fighting in isolated pockets, low on ammunition, and with casualties mounting at an alarming rate. The victory by Christmas, promised by command, now seemed like a bitter joke. For Kapaun and the men of the 3rd Battalion, the battle was over. A new, more grueling trial was about to begin. As the remnants of the 3rd Battalion attempted a fighting withdrawal, they were funneled towards a critical choke point known as Pyoktong Pass. The area was a death trap, a killing field swept by relentless Chinese machine gun and mortar fire. The order came down for all able-bodied soldiers to evacuate immediately, to break out of the encirclement and save themselves. For the dozens of grievously wounded men left behind in an abandoned church and scattered in ditches along the road, it was a death sentence. They were too injured to move, and there was no one left to carry them. This was the moment of Chaplain Kapaun's defining choice. He was uninjured. He could have easily escaped with the others. But as he watched the able-bodied men begin to fall back, he turned and walked back into the storm of fire. He refused to abandon his wounded. Several officers ordered him to leave, telling him he could do no more. His response, according to witnesses, was simple and unwavering. He told them he would not leave his men. He saw a duty that superseded any order for self-preservation. This was not a rash or emotional decision. It was the culmination of his entire life's philosophy of service. He believed his place was with the most vulnerable, the suffering, the men who had no one else. As bullets kicked up dirt around his feet and shells exploded nearby, Kapaun began his solitary mission. He moved from man to man, checking wounds, offering water, and speaking words of comfort. His refusal to retreat was an act of profound defiance, not against his own command, but against the brutal logic of war that dictates the wounded are sometimes left behind. He was establishing a new perimeter, one not defined by firepower, but by compassion. His battlefield was now the space between life and death for the soldiers entrusted to his care. With the battle raging around him, Kapaun moved through the no-man's land near Pyoktong Pass with a purpose that seemed to defy the chaos. He ignored the whizzing bullets and the crump of mortars, focusing only on the cries of the wounded. He crawled into exposed ditches to drag injured soldiers to the relative safety of a roadside dugout. One of the men he rescued was Sergeant Herbert Miller, who had a shattered ankle and could not walk. Kapaun found him, hoisted him onto his back, and began carrying him to safety. The sheer physical effort was immense, but the moral courage was even greater. He was a clear target, a lone figure moving against the tide of battle, yet he continued his work. As Chinese soldiers began closing in, overrunning the last pockets of resistance, Kapaun's mission shifted from rescue to negotiation. He approached the enemy soldiers not with a weapon, but with his hands raised. Through a wounded Chinese-American soldier acting as an interpreter, he began to negotiate for the safety of the American wounded. He calmly explained that they were non-combatants, too injured to fight, and requested that they be treated humanely as prisoners of war. It was an act of incredible bravery, stepping into the path of an advancing enemy force that had just spent hours in brutal combat. A moment of extreme tension followed. A Chinese soldier, seeing a wounded American, Sergeant First Class Bernard Funston, lying nearby, raised his rifle to execute him. Without hesitation, Kapaun intervened. He walked calmly between the soldier and the wounded man, gently pushing the rifle aside. Eyewitness accounts state he simply bowed his head in a gesture of peace. The Chinese soldier, stunned by the chaplain's fearlessness and quiet authority, lowered his weapon. In that instant, Kapaun had saved a life not with force, but with faith and an appeal to a shared, if hidden, humanity. He had transformed the battlefield into a sanctuary. Having successfully negotiated the surrender of his wounded flock, Chaplain Kapaun made another fateful choice. The Chinese forces were rounding up prisoners, separating the injured from those who could walk. Kapaun, still unhurt, could have attempted to blend in with other captives and perhaps find an opportunity to escape. Instead, he made a conscious decision. He volunteered to stay with the wounded. He knew that without his care and advocacy, many of these men would perish from their injuries, the cold, or neglect. He willingly chose the path of a prisoner of war to continue his ministry. This decision sealed his fate, leading him and his fellow captives on a brutal forced march north towards the Yalu River and the permanent POW camps. This was the start of a death march that would claim countless lives. The prisoners were given little to no food, and forced to march for miles through the unforgiving mountains in sub-zero temperatures. The weak and the wounded who fell behind were often left to die or were shot by their guards. Throughout this horrific ordeal, Kapaun became a pillar of strength. He helped carry wounded men who could no longer walk, including Sergeant Miller, whom he had already saved on the battlefield. When his own feet became raw and frostbitten, he fashioned makeshift moccasins from grass and wire. He encouraged others, urging them to put one foot in front of the other, to not give up. Fellow POWs recalled him sharing his meager rations, giving away what little he had to men who were weaker than him. He would move up and down the long, stumbling column of prisoners, checking on men, offering prayers, and instilling a flicker of hope in their hearts. He was living the very words of the gospel he preached, bearing the burdens of others even as he suffered himself. His choice was not just to become a prisoner, but to become the shepherd of prisoners, guiding them through the valley of the shadow of death. The destination of the death march was the infamous prisoner of war camp near Pyoktong, North Korea, a collection of miserable huts on the frozen banks of the Yalu River. It was a place designed to break men's bodies and spirits. Starvation, disease, and the relentless cold were the true camp commandants. Dysentery, pneumonia, and pellagra ran rampant. The daily food ration was often just a small bowl of millet or cracked corn, a starvation diet that left men skeletal and weak. The Chinese and North Korean guards enforced a brutal regime, supplemented by intense psychological warfare and indoctrination sessions aimed at forcing prisoners to denounce their country. In this desolate hell, Chaplain Kapaun's ministry reached its zenith. He became known as the Angel of Pyoktong. He worked tirelessly to care for the sick and dying, cleaning their wounds, boiling water to prevent the spread of disease, and washing their soiled clothes in the freezing river, an act that likely hastened his own physical decline. He was a master forager and a daring thief. He would sneak out of the camp at night, risking severe punishment or death, to steal food, corn, salt, potatoes from the guards' own supplies. He would return with his pockets bulging, sharing the food with the men most in need. The prisoners called him the Good Thief. His leadership extended beyond physical care. He organized prayer services in secret, whispering the words of the Mass to small groups huddled in the dark. These acts of faith were strictly forbidden and incredibly risky, but they provided immense spiritual comfort and a sense of normalcy in an insane world. He urged men to forgive their captors, reminding them that hatred would only consume them. He constantly boosted morale, telling stories, cracking jokes, and reminding everyone that they were American soldiers who needed to stick together. He became the heart of the resistance in Pyoktong, not a resistance of weapons, but of faith, hope, and an unbreakable human spirit. Chaplain Kapaun's constant defiance of the camp authorities made him a prime target. The guards saw him as a threat to their control, an uncooperative reactionary who undermined their indoctrination efforts. His open acts of faith, like the Easter sunrise service he conducted in 1951, were met with punishment. But he refused to be silenced. He publicly called out the guards for their cruelty and their failure to provide adequate medical care, as promised under the Geneva Conventions. His resistance was not loud or violent. It was a steady, unyielding pressure of moral truth against a system of oppression. This constant self-sacrifice, however, took a severe toll. Months of starvation, overwork, and exposure to the elements had ravaged his body. By the spring of 1951, he had developed a blood clot in his leg and was suffering from dysentery and pneumonia. He grew weaker each day, but continued to serve others, hearing confessions and giving blessings from his cot. The camp commanders saw their opportunity to finally break him and the morale of the other prisoners. They refused him medicine and proper care. When he became too weak to resist, the guards carried him away to a separate building the prisoners called the Death House, a place where the sick were taken to die in isolation, without food or water. As they took him away, his fellow POWs tried to intervene, but they were too weak to fight. Kapaun's final words to them were not of despair, but of forgiveness and faith. He told them, "I'm going to where I've always wanted to go, and when I get there, I'll say a prayer for all of you." He asked them to forgive his captors, for they knew not what they did. On May 23, 1951, Chaplain Emil Kapaun died of malnutrition and pneumonia, alone in the death house. He was just 35 years old. Even in death, Chaplain Kapaun's influence persisted. His sacrifice became a unifying legend among the prisoners of Pyoktong. The men he saved and inspired made a vow. If they ever made it out alive, they would tell the world his story. They credited him with saving hundreds of lives, not just through his physical actions, but by giving them the will to live when all hope seemed lost. When the Korean War armistice was signed in 1953, the surviving POWs returned home, and they kept their promise. They began a tireless campaign to have his heroism officially recognized. For decades, they wrote letters, gave interviews, and lobbied military officials and politicians. They described his bravery at Unsan, his defiance in the face of executioners, and his saint-like compassion in the brutal conditions of the POW camp. Their testimonies painted a consistent picture of a man of unwavering faith and unbreakable courage. One of the men he saved, Ray Kapaun's cousin, was among those who championed his cause. The process was long and arduous. Military awards often require specific, verifiable accounts of combat actions, and the chaos of the Unsan route and the secrecy of the POW camp made documentation difficult. But the sheer volume and consistency of the eyewitness accounts from dozens of fellow soldiers were undeniable. They built an irrefutable case for his extraordinary valor. Simultaneously, a different kind of recognition was beginning. His life story resonated so deeply that the Roman Catholic Church, specifically the Diocese of Wichita, Kansas, opened an investigation into his life and virtues. In 1993, the church declared him a servant of God, the first official step on the long road to potential sainthood. The farm boy from Kansas who became a shepherd to soldiers was now being considered a saint for the universal church, a testament to a life that transcended the battlefield. The decades of effort by his fellow soldiers finally culminated on April 11, 2013. In a solemn ceremony at the White House, President Barack Obama posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor to Chaplain Emil Kapaun. The medal, the United States' highest military decoration for valor, was accepted by his nephew, Ray Kapaun. The citation read during the ceremony detailed his incredible actions on the battlefield and in the POW camp, officially cementing his legacy as one of the great heroes in American military history. He remains the only U.S. Army chaplain to receive this honor for actions during the Korean War. But the story did not end there. For 70 years, Kapaun's body lay in an unknown grave in North Korea. He was one of thousands of American service members whose remains were never recovered. Then, in March 2021, the impossible happened. The Defense POW/MIA accounting agency announced that Chaplain Kapaun's remains had been identified. They had been among those returned by North Korea decades earlier, but had remained unidentified in a military cemetery in Hawaii. Using modern DNA analysis and skeletal forensics, scientists were able to make a positive match. After 70 years in foreign soil, the hero was finally coming home. In September 2021, his remains were flown back to Kansas. Thousands of people lined the streets to pay their respects as his casket, draped in the American flag, was escorted to his home diocese. A funeral mass, attended by military and religious dignitaries from around the country, was held at Hartman Arena in Wichita, allowing the public he served to bid him a final farewell. He was finally laid to rest in a crypt inside the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception in Wichita, a permanent shrine where his story of faith and sacrifice can continue to inspire future generations. The legacy of Chaplain Emil Kapaun is a powerful testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. He is remembered not only as a soldier who was awarded the Medal of Honor, but as a priest who lived his faith to the fullest, and a man who embodied the creed of leaving no one behind. His story continues to be a source of inspiration for the U.S. Army Chaplain Corps, where he is held up as the archetype of a servant leader. The Kapaun Memorial Chapel at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, stands as a tribute to his service, a place where new generations of soldiers can learn about his courage and sacrifice. His example provides a moral compass, demonstrating that even in the brutal calculus of war, compassion and selflessness are the most powerful weapons. Beyond the military, his cause for sainthood in the Catholic Church elevates his story to a global stage. He is seen as a modern martyr, a model of Christian virtue who found holiness not in a monastery, but in the foxholes and prison camps of North Korea. Miracles have been attributed to his intercession, and his declaration as venerable by Pope Francis in 2021 moved him one step closer to being officially recognized as a saint. This dual recognition, as a national hero and a potential saint, is exceptionally rare. It speaks to the universal appeal of his actions, which resonate with people of all faiths and backgrounds. He proved that true strength is found in service, true honor is found in sacrifice, and true freedom is found in a faith that cannot be imprisoned or broken. His life was a sermon delivered not in words, but in deeds, a heroic tale of a shepherd who laid down his life for his flock. Thank you for joining WW2 Heroic Tales. Through the stories of brave souls from World War II, we honor their memory and keep their legacy alive for history and generations to come.